In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific night. Destroyers and cruisers escorted supply columns through the Solomons and the Philippines while the United States Surface Fleet rebuilt after Pearl Harbor. Into that imbalance, the Navy deployed an experiment. Small wooden boats assembled in weeks, trained for darkness, and sent to the choke points where steel convoys had moved unchallenged. These patrol torpedo boats were simple and fast. A mahogany hull carried 3 Packard V-12 engines, 4 torpedoes, and light guns. Armor was minimal, endurance short, and many officers doubted they could survive a minute under searchlights. Yet their speed, shallow draft, and tight turning radius matched the reefs and narrows better than heavy ships ever could. At first, opponents laughed at their size. Then, in black water off Tulagi and in the straits of New Georgia, the boats slashed across convoy tracks, fired at close range, and vanished into shadow before guns could settle. Supply lines lost hours to detours and confusion. Crews on both sides began calling them Mosquitoes for how often they returned before dawn. How did fragile wooden craft built in days and armed lightly force steel columns to slow, scatter, and miss deadlines that fed entire island garrisons? The answer began the year the Pacific balance looked least favorable to the United States. At the start of 1942, the Pacific balance favored Japan. Its surface forces escorted night convoys through the Solomons while the United States rebuilt after Pearl Harbor. Carriers carried the strategic weight, yet they could not police every strait, lagoon, and reef where barges and transports moved. A gap appeared between Grand Fleet actions and the nightly work of keeping garrisons supplied. The Navy's answer had roots before the shooting. In 1938, the Bureau of Ships opened trials for motor torpedo boats. Civilian yards, Elko in New Jersey, Higgins in New Orleans, and Huckins in Florida, delivered competing prototypes. By 1941, an Elko hull of 77 feet led early production with a Higgins frame close behind. The idea was simple: speed and a torpedo battery inside a hull small enough for the littorals. Design choices reflected constraints. The boats were planked in mahogany to save weight and time. 3 Packard V-12 gasoline engines drove separate shafts and delivered more than 4,000 horsepower. Standard armament started with 4 torpedo tubes and twin heavy machine guns, with depth charges lashed on deck. Protection was minimal, endurance short, and crew spaces cramped to the edge of usefulness. Skepticism was open and persistent. Senior officers questioned whether a wooden craft could survive destroyer gunfire or open sea weather. Some nicknamed them plywood coffins. Advocates argued that in narrow waters firepower mattered less than acceleration, turning radius, and a draft shallow enough to cut inside reefs. The debate would be settled by contact, not by memoranda. War pushed the program forward. Late 1941 saw the first patrol torpedo squadrons formed and sent west. The Philippines exposed both promise and limits. Torpedoes misfired, spray-soaked gun mounts, and night identification proved hazardous. Crews learned to idle in shadow, sprint for a short crossing, fire at close range, and disappear under smoke before searchlights stabilized. Leadership emerged from those weeks. Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 ran harassment sorties and reconnaissance, then executed a high-risk evacuation. In March 1942, PT-41 carried General Douglas MacArthur out of Corregidor through patrol lines and air threat. The mission did not sink a ship, yet it demonstrated navigation, endurance, and nerve under pressure, and it moved opinion inside the fleet. As the fight shifted to the Solomons, geography favored small hulls. Tulagi and later Rendova offered forward bases close to choke points such as Iron Bottom Sound and Kula Gulf. Maintenance parties learned to replank hulls by lantern, swap engines in days, and return damaged boats to patrol before the next moonrise. Cheap construction made rapid repair a credible strategy. Training caught up with need. Crews drilled compass navigation, sound discipline, and coordinated section tactics. Standard orders emphasized silent departure, strict fire control, and no loitering after a torpedo run. By mid-1942, the boats were no longer experiments in search of a mission. They had a defined role: deny the enemy easy movement in the Narrows while the big fleet fought for the open sea. Japan's early advance depended on night convoys that slipped through reefs and straits to feed forward garrisons. Heavy American ships risked reefs, mines, and ambush if they chased deep into those passages. The Navy framed a clear objective: deny movement in confined waters with speed and surprise. Japan aimed to keep the lifeline open by sprinting destroyers and staging barges along the inner reef. Before full war pressure, the Navy had tested small torpedo craft in quiet trials. Elko, Higgins, and Huckins built competing hulls with different frames in Chinese. Runs off Florida showed hard slamming and chop, heavy spray, and engine noise that carried on still nights. Yet the concept of a fast pack that could strike at short range remained convincing to planners who studied island charts. Commitment followed quickly. By late 1941, squadrons formed around 3 Packard gasoline engines on separate shafts. A mahogany hull kept weight low and repairs simple. Standard weapons were 4 torpedo tubes, twin heavy machine guns, and a few depth charges. Range was limited and armor minimal, but acceleration and turning radius matched the geometry of reefs and narrows. Early deployments exposed limits and taught fixes. The long Mark 8 torpedo asked for deliberate approaches and calm water. Misfires and depth errors forced closer shots. Open mounts drowned in spray and crews tired under constant wet. Navigation by compass and dark shoreline tested judgment. Training shifted to night discipline, silent station keeping, and time dashes across predicted tracks. Objectives hardened in the Philippines. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, under Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley, received orders to scout, harass landings, and strike transports. Crews learned to idle in mangrove shadow, drift to cut engine noise, and fire at ranges that reduced torpedo runtime. Each successful dash bought hours for ground forces under pressure from sea and air. Bulkeley's boats proved endurance and nerve during the Corregidor evacuation. In March 1942, PT-41 ferried General Douglas MacArthur and party through patrol lines and air threat to safety. The mission did not sink an enemy hull, but it validated navigation, fuel planning, and crew coordination under stress. The story reached Washington and moved doubters toward guarded support. The Solomons became the live laboratory. Bases at Tulagi and later Rendova placed sections within sprinting distance of Iron Bottom Sound, Kula Gulf, and Blackett Strait. Geography shaped method. Narrow cuts forced convoys into lines. Headlands cast deep shadow even on bright nights. Boats practiced right-angle crossings, abeam shots, and quick turns back into darkness. Equipment evolved in step with tactics. Roll-off racks began to replace bulky tubes, allowing the shorter Mark 13 torpedo to arm quickly and enter at rougher angles. A bow 20mm mount appeared on many decks, and some boats added a single Bofors on a field stand. The trade was clear, a small loss in speed for a larger bite against barges and patrol craft. Electronics narrowed the guesswork. Compact SO surface search radar reached frontline squadrons by late 1942. A green trace and steady bearings turned chance into plotted intercepts. Crews learned to merge radar with visual clues such as wake brightness and phosphorescence. Smoke canisters, code lamps, and simple plotting boards completed a practical night toolkit. Command refined formations for the dark. Sections of 2 or 4 boats took stations across channel mouths, with one radar guide and a wingman offset by a measured distance. A typical intercept began with a picket bearing, a sprint at set speed, and a short, clean firing angle. Orders emphasized close ranges, simultaneous releases, and immediate breakaways under smoke. Japan adjusted quickly. Destroyers fired star shells to bleach the dark and ran lookouts on the upper deck. Barges crept behind reefs where deep-running torpedoes could not reach. In reply, the boats split duties. Torpedo sections stalked the main track, while gunnery sections combed reef lines and lagoon mouths. Every counter forced new drills and cleaner coordination between pairs. Maintenance made the scheme credible. Salt-8 fittings and coral-scarred planks. Packards demanded strict hours and careful hands. Shore crews learned to plane scarred planks, scarf patches, and swap engines in days. Fuel and spares moved forward on small craft so a damaged hull could return by the next moon. Low unit cost made rapid repair a rational strategy. Leadership pressed for honest debriefs. After each patrol, skippers sketched tracks in grease pencil, timed runs, and compared radar plots with sightings. Rules emerged from practice. Never hold a straight line under searchlights, avoid firing alone when a pair could divide attention, and do not loiter after a shot. The notebook grew into doctrine one correction at a time. Weather became both tool and hazard. Squalls masked engine noise, but muddied radar. Crews learned to ride the back edge of rain and burst into clearer water at the moment a convoy crossed their bow. Moon phase set patrol plans. On dark nights, boats pushed deeper into channels. On bright nights, they hugged shadow lines under points and waited for wakes to glow. By mid-1943, doctrine matured. Headquarters accepted that small craft could tax nightly movement through straits. Orders shifted from opportunistic harassment to scheduled interdiction. Sectors were assigned like picket lines, relief sections overlapped to avoid gaps, and spare engines were staged forward. The weapon had moved from experiment to a theater tool. Industry matched the need. Elco advanced an 80-foot hull with revised deck layout, while Higgins delivered a 78-foot design prized for a drier ride. Assembly methods standardized frames, wiring looms, and control runs. Training at Melville expanded, teaching boat handling, torpedo ballistics, radar plotting, and section tactics that turned crews into interchangeable teams. Across the water, Japanese intent stayed constant: keep supplies moving to Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and beyond. To protect that flow, destroyers sprinted the slot and barges hopped island to island under cover of reefs. American planners responded with layered patrol nights, pairing small craft with dusk and dawn aircraft, so any convoy faced pressure across the full 24 hours. By late 1943, one decision lit the fuse for the next phase. The Navy concentrated squadrons at the hottest narrows, paired them with search aircraft at twilight, and ordered that convoys be treated as primary targets rather than nuisances. With radar fitted, racks loaded, and crews drilled, the boat stood ready to turn nightly contact into sustained interdiction. The spark had become a plan. The battlefield narrowed to reefs, points, and night lanes. In late 1942, the Solomons became a sequence of straits where columns raced for Guadalcanal and New Georgia. Destroyers drove the express. Barges slipped behind the inner reef. PT sections learned each bend, each tide line, and waited where wakes brightened first under the moon. A typical section used two boats. The guide held the radar and the plot. The wingman kept visual guard and matched course on an offset. Engines idled behind a point until the trace steadied. When the bearing crossed the chalked line, throttles went forward, hulls rose, and the pair cut across the convoy's track at a measured angle. Early runs still used the Long Mark 8. It was fast and lethal, but it asked for a straight approach and distance to arm. Crews closed to short range, fired 2 fish per target, then broke away at full power. On bright nights, star shells turned the water pale. On dark nights, phosphorescent wakes betrayed every turn. Each contact refined the next plan. Escorts answered with light and speed. Star shells burst above in steady rhythms. Searchlights carved tunnels through spray. Heavy guns stitched the surface with tracers. Boats lived by never holding a straight course, by smoking the turn, and by trusting that a small silhouette could pass between splashes. Survival measured success as surely as damage to a target. Forward bases kept the tempo. Tulagi, then Rendova, became repair hives with fuel drums under palms and ways built from timber. Crews slept in shifts near engines. Lantern light showed planed planks, scarf joints, and fresh copper tacks. A damaged hull that reached the beach at dawn could return to patrol by the next moon if parts and hands were ready. Radar shortened the guesswork. The compact SO set gave bearings beyond human hearing. Instead of wandering for chance contacts, sections moved to pre-planned intercept points. The guide called speeds and course corrections by stopwatch. The wingman held a fixed offset for simultaneous angles. A grease pencil track on the chart house became a hit rather than a hope. Weapon fits evolved. Roll-off racks replaced heavy tubes on many decks. The shorter Mark 13 armed sooner and entered cleanly at rougher angles. Crews could now fire while cutting a sharper crossing. Bow mounts gained a 20mm Oerlikon. Some boats carried a single Bofors on a field stand. Speed fell slightly, but close-range bite increased. Gunnery became its own mission. After torpedo work scattered a column, sections shifted to barge sweeps along the inner reef. The game was practical. Aim at the waterline, blind a gunner with short bursts at the bow, then close from the quarter. Torpedoes were saved for ships that needed deep holes. Barges were reduced with guns and patience. Geography set the hunt. Iron Bottom Sound, Kula Gulf, and Blackett Strait forced traffic near land. Headlands cast deep shadow even under a high moon. A boat could wait in that stripe with engines low and watch wakes glow past open water. When the radar plot crossed the chosen line, the section rose and the run began with yards rather than miles to spare. Discipline saved seconds. Torpedo men stood at the releases with safeties ready. The skipper kept one eye on bow angle and one on the stopwatch. Gunners held their fire until the wakes turned away. Only then did the deck erupt to blind the pursuer and cover the breakaway. A run that lasted less than a minute could decide a night. Japan adjusted its routine. Destroyers drifted star shells behind them to wash out the dark. Small patrol craft checked shoals. Barges hugged the inner reef where deep torpedoes ran beneath. PTs divided roles in reply. Torpedo sections watched the main track in the open. Gunnery sections combed reef edges and lagoon mouths where supply moved slowly and often. Wear and tear were constant. Salt gnawed at fittings, spray-soaked open mounts, and chilled crews. Packard engines demanded strict hours and careful hands. Shore parties learned to swap a power plant in days, to plane a scarred plank, and to reset frames with clamps and wedges. Logistics moved fuel and spares forward in small craft to hold the line each dusk. Debriefs fixed, doctrine one correction at a time. After patrol, skippers sketched tracks with chalk, time dashes, and matched radar bearings to sightings. Rules hardened. Avoid straight lines under lights, attack in pairs when possible, clear the racks, and break contact immediately, and never loiter to count damage. The notebook grew into orders that repeated across bases. Weather taught its own lessons. Squalls hid engine noise but muddled radar and aim. Experienced skippers rode the back edge of rain and burst into clearer water at the moment a target crossed the bow. Moon phase drove planning. On dark nights, sections pushed deeper into channels. On bright nights, they hugged shadow bands and let convoys pass into pre-marked angles. By mid-1943, interdiction replaced harassment. Headquarters accepted that small craft could tax every mile of narrow water. Sectors were assigned like picket stations. Relief sections overlapped to avoid gaps. Spare engines and racks were staged forward. The strategy was simple: turn movement at night into a chain of risks that no convoy could fully avoid. Scale followed. On busy nights, several sections formed a loose net across a gulf. One pair watched the eastern mouth, another the western, and a third sat inside the bend to catch a dodge. Radar guides shared bearings in short code. When a column committed to a turn, at least one pair was already in the right place, and the run began on schedule. The ledger measured results in minutes as well as holes. Not every shot struck. Some spreads showed only white tracks and angry lights. Yet even a miss forced maneuvers that broke alignment, bled speed, and burned fuel. A convoy that arrived at dawn rather than at night met aircraft and surface patrols. Delay multiplied risk without further effort from the boats. Losses never stopped. A single shell could wreck a wheelhouse or cut a fuel line, and gasoline fires were unforgiving. Boats struck coral in black water and broke their backs. Crews went over the side and were found by wingmen, coast watchers, or fishermen. Each debrief wrote a caution in the log. The next night launched with that lesson built in. Blackett Strait framed a harsh warning. In August 1943, a fast destroyer column cut through at speed. In moments, a Magiri struck PT 109 and scattered its crew into the dark. Rescue followed through jungle and reef with help from coast watchers and islanders. The loss drove changes to spacing, identification, and radar cross-checks that spread through every squadron. Industrial depth held the tempo. Elko's 80-foot hulls and Higgins's 78-foot boats arrived as refined tools, not trials. Wiring looms, control runs, and frames were standardized. Training at Melville enlarged its syllabus to radar plots, torpedo ballistics, and section drills. Crews rotated in with shared methods that reduced error and preserved initiative. Air and sea built a shared clock. Dusk searches fixed first bearings. Night sections took the handoff and pressed the convoy. Dawn flights punished delay. Noon searches prepared the next evening's plot. The smallest craft and the largest machines turned interdiction into a 24-hour cycle that no single defense could break for long. Enemy counters grew sharper. Mines appeared in likely ambush cuts. Drifters seeded narrow passes. Decoy barges tried to pull a section into a trap. Charts marked hazards at once. Offsets widened through mined reaches, and radar contacts were checked by wake and time, rather than hunger for a target. Prudence conserved boats for nights when a real convoy ran. Gunnery sweeps earned formal place in plans. After a torpedo attack drew escorts outward, boats shifted aft along the route to cut barges fleeing toward beaches. 20-millimeter mounts chewed through thin planking. Twin heavy guns raked decks and silenced return fire. A short pause to cool barrels and check drums led to another chase under a new headland. The effect on garrisons showed in captured messages and reports. Units recorded ration cuts and late ammunition. Requests for more barge escorts rose. Destroyers were tied to convoy duty instead of larger battles. The boats did not decide a fleet action. They denied the enemy the freedom to schedule one on his preferred terms. Crews carried the strain in nerves and hands. Patrol rosters rotated men to shore after long strings of nights, then pulled them back because experience could not be stockpiled. Medics taped burns and treated salt-cracked skin. Chaplains spoke near engines and rain. The currency of this campaign was endurance, paid in small amounts every dusk. Method matured into restraint. Skippers learned to pass on a poor lane and hold position for a better angle an hour later. Sections that preserved weapons and cover made more of the night's chances. Patience, not constant charge, lifted the tally and kept men alive for the next patrol and the next strait on the chart. The pattern traveled with the advance. When pressure eased in the Central Solomons, squadrons leapfrogged to New Guinea and later toward the Philippines. New coasts offered familiar narrows. Forward bases rose in small harbors and lagoons, and the nightly ledger resumed. The same rules held: intercept at choke points, fire at close range, clear the area, repair, and return. Coordination with larger forces tightened. In the approaches to the Philippines, PTs screened straits, relayed contacts, and pressed columns that threatened the landings. In Surigao Strait, sections probed the southern approach and fired spreads that helped break cohesion before battleships executed the classic crossfire. Small craft shaped the geometry that larger guns completed. Enemy traffic adapted again by shrinking into more barge hops and adding escorts to scarce convoys. Each change carried cost. More hops meant more handoffs and more chances for contact. More escorts meant fewer destroyers for other battles. The tax on movement charged each night began to shape plans ashore as much as patrol routes at sea. Logs recorded the tempo without flourish. Depart at dusk. Intercept by midnight. Break contact near 1. Barge chase until 3. Fuel and repairs at dawn. Sleep by morning rain. Repeat. The record kept position, course, speed, range, and result. Behind dry lines lived cold hands, engine howl, and quick judgments that could not be rehearsed outside the patrol. Doctrine settled into a few sentences. Fight in sections. Use radar to plan, not to steer the last yards. Fire at short range. Do not stay to observe damage. Switch from torpedoes to guns when the target is a barge or a drift of small craft. Repair before the next moon. That clarity gave young skippers a stable frame for decisions they made in seconds. Material limits never vanished. Gasoline fires remained lethal. Hulls carried patchwork seams and burn scars as the months passed. Every base held a grave list as well as a duty roster. Yet the boats endured because the method produced results that men could see in empty beaches, in thinner gunfire from the tree line, and in convoys that arrived late or not at all. By late 1943, the nickname settled. Sailors on both sides used Mosquito Fleet without drama. It described a feeling more than a boast. small stings that arrived often, forced motion, and disappeared before a SWAT landed. The term spread through reports and orders, and with it came the unspoken admission that the littorals were no longer permissive at night. The strategic thread was simple. In waters confined by land and reef, speed and surprise could impose a fixed nightly cost on movement. That cost altered schedules, drew escorts away, and reduced what reached a beach. The boats did not need to be everywhere. They had to be present often enough that planners assumed they were just ahead, and that assumption slowed the war. As operations pushed north and west, the cycle held. New charts replaced old, but the chalked lines on chart house walls looked the same. The work remained a blend of radar bearings, moon angles, wake brightness, and engine hours. The men remained a blend of practiced calm and sudden violence measured in seconds and yards. By the close of the Solomons phase, the smallest warships in the theater had proved a durable tool. They showed that a Navy could buy time and outcomes with wood, gasoline, and train crews when geography constrained steel. The turning point was not a single explosion. It was the acceptance on both sides that the Narrows belonged to those who mastered the night. The boats turned for home at dawn with new chalk marks and old scars. Entries were made, fuel was taken, planks were planed, and engines were timed. The next dusk waited with another bearing and another wake. The method had become the message: hold the choke points, strike on schedule, and make movement unreliable until plans ashore bend to the sea. By mid-1943, the pattern had hardened. Convoys slowed, barges multiplied, and escorts burned fuel on detours. Command raised the bar from harassment to denial. PT sections were tasked to turn every Narrow into a scheduled risk, measured in ships lost, hours missed, and garrisons left short at dawn. Blackett Strait delivered the stark reminder of cost. In August 1943, a fast destroyer line crossed the patrol lanes at speed. In seconds, Amagiri struck PT-109 and split the boat in the dark. The crew scattered across fuel-slick water while the column vanished into the night track toward Kolombangara. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy gathered survivors on floating wreckage and the bow section. Coast watchers and Solomon Islanders relayed position through jungle and reef. A message carved on a coconut reached Allied hands, and a rescue followed days later. The patrol had missed its strike, but the aftermath rewrote procedures across every squadron in theater. Debriefs were blunt. Sections widened intervals to prevent mutual glare and wake confusion. Identification rules tightened before closing. Radar plots were cross-checked by time and probable speed rather than by wish. A single collision produced spacing tables, bearing calls, and approach ceilings that saved crews who would never read the PT-109 report. The human cost stayed visible. Crews buried friends near fuel dumps, then launched at dusk. Engine fires scarred hands. Medics learned to treat gasoline burns and salt cracked skin in cramped cabins. The service answered with more foam, stricter fueling drills, and practiced abandoned ship routines. Checklists appeared because names were missing at muster. Results justified the strain. Through late 1943, traffic into New Georgia and Kolombangara thinned. Destroyers still ran the express, but they paid a tax in speed, fuel, and escorts peeled from other tasks. Captured reports described rations cut by patrol day rather than by plan. Ammunition arrived late and was issued by skirmish, not by operation. With pressure easing in the central Solomons, squadrons leapfrogged to New Guinea. Shallow bays, mangrove mouths, and reef cuts repeated the old geometry. Doctrine traveled intact: intercept at choke points, fire at close range, break contact, and return for repair before the next moon. Torpedo runs opened nights. Gunnery chases closed them against barges hugging shore. Industry kept tempo. Elko and Higgins delivered refined hulls with standardized frames and wiring looms. Packard engines arrived in crates with tool rolls and spares. A hull that limped onto the ways at dawn could be replanked, re-engined, and test run in days. Low unit cost meant attrition did not erase presence. The enemy felt that cadence without seeing the pier. The Philippines campaign lifted stakes again. Before the landings, PTs seeded approaches with risk and relayed contacts from narrow entries. During Leyte operations, sections shadowed straits and took shots at fast columns pushing toward the Gulf. The boats did not decide the battle, but they forced timing errors that larger forces punished. In Surigao Strait, sections probed the southern approach at night. Spreads fired from short range helped fracture formation and forced evasive turns. Dawn found battleships set for a classic crossfire. Small craft had shaped the geometry that heavy guns completed. The doctrine of the Narrows, delay, disperse, and disorganize, scaled into a fleet action without changing a line. After the beachheads, the mission returned to hunger. Barges moved mortar rounds, rice, and small arms along back channels. PT sections ran them down at night, aiming at waterlines and engines, and then shifting to the next wake under tracer. The tally did not appear as tonnage sunk. It appeared as shorter firefights ashore and positions abandoned for lack of supply. Leadership matured under pressure. Skippers who had survived a year taught restraint as a tactic. A poor lane at midnight was not worth a boat and a crew. The pair that passed on a bad shot often took a clean angle an hour later. Measured aggression raised results and preserved teams that no training school could replace in time. Enemy counters evolved. Patrol craft mounted heavier guns and practiced faster searchlight drill. Mines fenced likely ambush cuts. Decoy craft tried to draw sections into traps. The reply was method. Charts marked hazards at once. Offsets widened through mined reaches. Radar returns were judged by wake, length, and time rather than by hunger for contact. Evidence of strategic effect accumulated in routine messages. Forward garrisons on Luzon and Borneo reported ration cuts and ammunition shortfalls. Requests for more barge escorts rose even as destroyers were needed elsewhere. Plans ashore slipped, shrank, or shifted to night probes with fewer rounds. The boats did not win battles alone. They removed the means to fight them as designed. Numbers told a cautious story. More than 500 PT boats were built. Dozens were lost to gunfire, collision, fire, or reef. Claims after night strikes remained contested, but logistics curves, convoy delays, and barge attrition matched what crews saw on scopes. Interdiction worked because movement became unreliable, not because every torpedo found a hull. The strain on people never left the ledger. Patrol rosters rotated men ashore after long strings of nights, then pulled them back because experience could not be stored on a pier. Chaplains spoke over engine noise and rain. Cooks learned to feed crews at odd hours between repairs. Endurance, recorded as hours on engines, and watches stood, became a weapon as real as a torpedo. PT-109 remained caution and emblem. Kennedy's later fame cast light backward on a community that rarely saw cameras. Within squadron huts, the story read as a chain from Coast Watcher huts to a hidden lagoon to a recovered crew. It underlined the quiet truth that local allies, navigation discipline, and patient signals often paid for courage in full. Tactics peaked in refinement during 1944. Radar discipline, timing, and breakaway drills turned runs into repeatable procedures. Crews rehearsed silent cast-offs, abeam angles, and throttle schedules that matched torpedo arming times. Surprise still mattered, but method carried more weight. A section that moved like a metronome made its own luck. Enemy traffic adapted by shrinking into island hops. Hops increased handoffs, and handoffs increased risk. Escorts multiplied around scarce convoys, pulling hulls from other demands. The nightly tax rose whether a shot hit or missed. Delay invited dawn, and dawn invited aircraft. Even an unhurt convoy paid with time it could not reclaim. Through 1945, the boats followed the map north and west. New charts replaced old, but the routine held. Intercept near midnight, barge chase near 2, fuel and repairs at dawn, sleep by morning rain, and another chalk line at dusk. Logs recorded position, course, speed, range, and result without flourish. The discipline of that cadence was the campaign. A final measure of success showed in what larger ships did not have to do. Destroyers and cruisers spent fewer nights inside reef-choked channels where a single navigation error could wedge steel onto coral. Carriers focused on strikes and coverage, not on convoy shepherding through narrows. Concentrated power at sea rested on dispersed pressure in the shallows. Surrender confirmed a quieter victory already earned, along coasts and straits. Many garrisons stood down hungry and short of ammunition. Convoys that might have moved relief arrived late or never. The boats had not fought set-piece duels against capital ships. They had fought for calendars and shipping cycles and had taken them away one night at a time. Demobilization arrived as orders, not ceremony. War-weary hulls bore patchwork seams and burn scars. Some were scuttled near forward bases rather than shipped home. Others passed to Allied services for patrol and training. Crews stepped ashore with habits formed by moonlines on water and by engines that answered or did not, without warning. The closing documents captured the doctrine in few lines. Fight in sections. Use radar to plan, not to steer the last yards. Fire at short range. Break contact at once. Shift to guns for barges. Repair before the next moon. These rules had been written by failure and confirmed by survival. They would outlive the wooden hulls that proved them. The strategic lesson was plain. In confined waters, speed and surprise can offset armor and tonnage when backed by training, repair, and persistence. A Navy that can build, crew, and fix small craft at scale can bleed an enemy's lifelines until larger battles become easier or unnecessary. The Pacific's narrows made that case each night. Memory settled where noise had been. Veterans recalled the seconds between the radar call and the rack release, the sudden glare of star shells, and the silence after a clean breakaway. Islands remembered silhouettes sliding between reefs and the sound of engines throttling hard in the dark. Maps remembered as gaps in supply and positions abandoned without a fight. By the end, the Mosquito fleet had turned laughter into caution, caution into delay, and delay into defeat, measured in empty docks and thinner fire ashore. The collapse of the convoy system did not happen in a single night. It sagged under steady pressure until plans failed and orders changed. The smallest craft had carried a heavy share and then stepped aside. Act 3 closed with cause and effect made explicit. Doctrine born of loss produced crews that survived to apply it again. Industry that delivered engines and planks on time produced presence that the enemy could not ignore. Each factor fed the next until convoys moved less, arrived later, and mattered less. The ledger of the Narrows balanced in the Allies' favor. When the war ended in 1945, the narrow waters fell quiet. Convoys stopped, patrol rosters dissolved, and small bases that had hummed at dusk turned into demobilization posts. Squadrons struck colors beside rough piers where hulls showed patch seams and burn scars. The record that remained was a weapons ledger and the procedures that had made it work. Disposal moved quickly. Shipping space was scarce and the boats were tired, so many hulls were scuttled near forward bases rather than hauled home. Others transferred to Allied services for coastal patrol and training. A few survived as museum craft, their planked sides preserving the shape of a fleet that fought a modern war with wood and gasoline. The Navy wrote the lessons while salt still stained the paint. Interdiction in confined waters favored sections, short ranges, rapid breakaways, and strict radar discipline. Repair practice, engine logs, and ammunition handling received the same weight as bravery reports. The message was procedural as much as heroic. Method turned fragile craft into reliable tools. Technology moved on, yet these boats nudged it forward. Roll-off racks and the shorter Mark 13 torpedo proved that launch geometry mattered as much as explosive yield. Compact SO surface search sets showed how electronics could shrink and still reshape a night. Packard engines set practical benchmarks for power, maintenance, and logistics at scale. Strategy absorbed the idea even as the platform faded. Torpedoes on tiny hulls yielded to countermeasures, but speed and surprise did not. Navies invested in fast attack craft armed with guns and later missiles to hold straits and gulfs at risk. The principle endured. Impose a nightly tax on movement where geography compresses an enemy into lanes. Rivers and deltas carried the doctrine inland. In Vietnam, patrol boat river craft and swift boats applied the same rhythm with different weapons. Crews ran interdiction against sampans and resupply lanes under canopy, using radios and spotlights where earlier sailors had used code lamps and star shells. The sequence remained: intercept, cut, break contact, and return. Industry's lesson was production at scale for small craft. Elko and Higgins proved that civilian yards could mass-produce complex wooden structures with repeatable quality. Prefabricated frames, wiring looms, and standardized controls shortened repair cycles at the front. A cheap hull, properly maintained, delivered strategic leverage when placed where the map multiplied its effect. The human legacy crossed charts and decades. Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley's early raids set a standard for small unit leadership. The survival of PT 109 linked Lieutenant John F. Kennedy to a community that rarely saw cameras and kept coast watchers and island scouts in the center of retellings. Networks of local allies became part of the doctrine, not a footnote. Operationally, the results were clear. An enemy that must cross confined water can be beaten by persistent interdiction rather than by a single set-piece battle. Delay, dispersal, and loss imposed every night add up to operational failure. The boats did not overthrow an empire alone. They made its logistics unreliable, and an unreliable lifeline collapses plans. Memory settled where noise had been. Veterans recalled the seconds between a radar bearing and a torpedo release, the glare of a star shell, and engines rising for a breakaway. Logs preserved positions, speeds, and results in dry lines. Islands remembered silhouettes sliding between reefs and a routine that turned darkness into a contested space. In the end, the Mosquito fleet left a wake larger than its beam. It proved that light forces used relentlessly and repaired without delay can shape a theater through repetition and discipline. The boats disappeared from orders of battle, but their doctrine remained in every plan that treats a strait, a gulf, or a river mouth as a battlefield of its own. The campaign in the Narrows ended without a single finale. Night after night, wooden hulls forced convoys to slow, detour, or turn back. Garrison reports thinned, barge losses rose, and escorts left larger battles to guard supply lines that still failed too often. Doctrine hardened into habit. Hold the choke points, fire at short range, break contact, repair, and return. The Mosquito fleet proved that disciplined repetition can turn delay into defeat, and that logistics, not headlines, decides who holds an island when dawn comes. While PT boats ruled the shallows, another small idea reshaped wider seas. Across the Pacific, escort carriers, short flight decks on slow hulls, spread aircraft over convoys, beachheads, and straits that big fleets could not cover every hour. Dismissed as jeep carriers, they became the backbone of anti-submarine screens, air rescue, and close support. By 1944, their composite squadrons were sinking barges by night and off Samar standing in the path of a battleship force. Next, the series follows those toy ships as they turned limited speed and thin armor into reach, endurance, and a shock the enemy never forgot. In 1938, the Navy opened motor torpedo boat trials that drew Elko, Higgins, and Huckins. By 1941, Elko's 77-foot class led early production, soon joined by Higgins' 78-foot hulls. 3 Packard V12 gasoline engines drove separate shafts to roughly 40 to 45 knots. Standard armament began with 4 21-inch torpedoes and twin .50 caliber guns, later joined by 20 mm Oerlikon, and on some boats, a single 40 mm Bofors. So surface search radar reached the fleet in late 1942. Squadrons formed in 1941 for the Philippines and the Solomons. Early patrols exposed torpedo arming limits, spray-soaked mounts, and difficult night identification. In March 1942, Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley's PT-41 evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor, proving range, navigation, and crew discipline under pressure. Forward bases learned fast repair. Replank by lantern, swap engines in days, and return damaged hulls before the next moon. From mid-1942, Tulagi and later Rendova put sections within sprinting distance of Iron Bottom Sound, Kula Gulf, and Blackett Strait. Early attacks used the long Mark 8 from tubes at short range. In 1943, roll-off racks and the shorter Mark 13 improved launch geometry. Doctrine settled on paired boats, radar-guided intercepts, abeam releases, and immediate breakaways under smoke. Harassment matured into scheduled interdiction by mid-1943. In August 1943, destroyer Amagiri rammed PT-109 in Blackett Strait. The rescue refined spacing, identification, and radar cross-checks across the force. Through 1943-1944, sections mixed torpedo ambush with gunnery sweeps against barges hugging reefs. Industrial output exceeded more than 500 PT boats, primarily from Elko and Higgins. Typical crews numbered 12 to 17. Dozens were lost to gunfire, collision, fire, or reef, but tempo held through rapid repair and rotation. In 1944-1945, PTs screened Philippine approaches, probed Surigao Strait ahead of the classic battleship Action, and continued nightly interdiction off New Guinea, Borneo, and Luzon. With surrender in 1945, many hulls were scuttled forward or transferred to Allies. The enduring method read plainly: fight in sections, fire at short range, break contact, repair, and return until supply failed.